So I'm going to get started. Again, welcome everyone to the UCLA Rapid, Rigorous, Relevant Implementation Science Hub Beachside Chat. It's a bit of a mouthful. I'm Alison Hamilton. I lead the UCLA 3R Hub and am so excited to host today's Beachside Chat. Our hub is supported by NIAID. We are very grateful for this support and is one of several hubs supporting the Ending the HIV Epidemic initiative. And we've been doing this together for a long time. So I'm sure many of our other hub colleagues are out there in the audience, or at least I hope so. For anyone who has not been to a beachside chat previously, just to let you know, this is an informal session. It's not meant to be super didactic or formal in any way. It really is a chance for us to talk about issues and topics that are interesting in implementation science. And today's topic is no exception. We are going to do a little bit of overview today, just because our topic may not be super familiar to everyone. But as with our other beachside chats, most of the time we are not in slideshow mode. We are chatting and looking to you, the audience, for your thoughts, ideas, questions, to be very much engaged in this chat. So please do feel free throughout the course of our time together today to use the chat, and we'll get a little bit more into your questions and ideas after some stage setting in the beginning. So I just want to express my gratitude to the folks who have joined me today for our topic of what are implementation mechanisms and why should we care about them. And I am joined by two amazing, wonderful colleagues and friends, Dr. Rebecca Lengnick-Hall from WashU in St. Louis and Dr. Rosemary Meza from Kaiser Permanente. Both of them have done really interesting work in this area and on this topic. And I must say that even in preparing for today's session, we've already had some really interesting chats. So I think it's going to be a lively topic for us to discuss. And I couldn't be happier to be doing this chat with these two folks who have contributed so much to implementation science. So welcome, Rebecca and Rosemary. Thank you again for being here. Before we get started, I'm going to just do a few polls, which is our usual way for the beachside chats, just to get a sense of who is with us today. First, if you could just share with us your primary affiliation, and Enrique is going to help us with our polls. Okay, so if you could just fill in your primary affiliation for us from these choices. Okay, so mostly, thank you everyone. So mostly academic institutions and healthcare systems and folks from a couple other places as well. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And our next poll is about your familiarity with implementation strategies. So strategies and mechanisms, for those who may not be super familiar with this terminology, they are connected. So first we're going to ask about strategies, and then we're going to ask about mechanisms. So let's start by just sharing your familiarity with implementation strategies. And it's totally fine if you don't know what they are, because we can work through that. Okay, so we have a nice balance. We've got a third who are very familiar, almost half somewhat, about a quarter who are vaguely, and a few who don't know what they are, and everyone is welcome. And now let's take a look at how familiar you are with implementation mechanisms. Okay, so uh, this is what I thought might be the case. Certainly is a less familiar topic, I think, in general in the field. So we've got about 40% somewhat familiar and the same amount vaguely, a handful of folks who are very familiar. Thank you for those who are very familiar being here today. We look forward to everyone's input across the board and several who don't know what they are as well. So I think that sets up your portion, Rebecca, really nicely in terms of just doing a little orientation so that we're on the same page thinking about our topic for today. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to share to give us an overview of what we're talking about today.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. And thank you for doing that poll. And before I jump into the mechanisms definition, I don't want to lose any of those folks who are not familiar with implementation strategies, and that is pretty integral to this topic. So the quickest, easiest way I explain implementation strategies are, and this is coming from me as a plant lady. You bought a new plant at the store. This is your thing. This is your intervention, your innovation. When you bring it home, you're not just going to like put it on the windowsill and expect it to survive. There are lots of things you're going to do to make sure that it lives on, it's healthy, it doesn't die immediately. That's similar to what implementation strategies are. You don't just bring an intervention to your organization, to your setting, to your system. There's lots of supports, water, sunlight, soil, etc. So that's kind of what we mean by implementation strategies. So mechanisms. The definition that we are going to use is from this foundational Kara Lewis et al. Paper in 2018. And the definition is a process or series of events through which an implementation strategy operates to affect desired implementation outcomes. I know that's very jargony, so I'm going to break that down to hopefully be as accessible as possible. So if I'm explaining this to partners who are not implementation researchers, the way I would translate this definition into more plain language is to say that mechanisms are the explanations or micro theories for how an implementation strategy works. It represents the step-by-step process that shows you and your team how you get from using the strategy to seeing a change in the implementation outcome that you care about and wanted to change by using that strategy. So let's look at this process or series of events part of the definition. What does that mean? It means that mechanisms are messy. They cannot be captured solely by a single variable, so they're not interchangeable with a mediator that you might have if you were doing a quantitative assessment. And with that series of events and process language, it hints to us that there's kind of this time element and this sequencing. So how does this series of things unfold over time and influence each other? And at the end of the definition, you see that it's anchored in this idea that we are trying to influence some sort of implementation outcome. So what does that tell you? It tells you that mechanisms are anchored in a particular implementation outcome because, again, we are talking about mechanisms of implementation strategies, and we use implementation strategies to improve the implementation process, which we measure by these implementation outcomes or signals. So what that means is we may have the same strategy, and if we're trying to change a different implementation outcome, the mechanistic process might look differently. So I'll revisit that concept in a bit. So let's get on the same page about terminology in case Rosemary and I use any of these words. So when we're thinking about mechanistic theorizing in the context of implementation strategies, again, we usually focus on implementation outcomes because strategies are designed to intervene upon the implementation process and basically improve it. However, We do also think about proximal outcomes, which are kind of those early signals that things are going well or maybe not going well. And we also can often carry the story out beyond the implementation outcome. So if we are successful in supporting a effective implementation process, what does that mean for those downstream things like clinical and service impact and improvement? If we say the word determinants, we mean barriers and facilitators. So again, all of this is within the context of an implementation strategy and how it works. So barriers are the challenges that a strategy might be addressing. Facilitators are the supports that a strategy might be leveraging. And here's the golden spot in the middle, potentially, mechanisms. So again, here's that definition. Mechanisms are a process or series of events through which an implementation strategy works to improve an implementation outcome. And the reason these constructs are side by side is because when we think about mechanisms, we are often making some kind of argument about how that strategy is either removing a barrier and or leveraging a facilitator. So one key thing that I think is important to establish before we get into this conversation is this idea that you have to look at mechanistic theorizing as a process with multiple interrelated parts. So I know when we first started talking about this in the field, one of the first things was like, is it the same as a mediator? Can we kind of treat it as a mediator? And I would ask you, would you ever just have plain old pizza sauce by itself? And if you would, hats off. But I think most of us want the sauce within the context of the whole pizza. And this is what I mean by the interrelated parts. So when we think about mechanisms, at least when I'm hearing people talk about mechanisms with a particular strategy, I want to know what the crust is. What implementation outcome are you trying to explain with this mechanism? On top of that, I want to know your local context. So if Rosemary and I were working with you on a CPD, you might hear us use language like barriers and facilitators, moderators, and preconditions. But the overall point is you can't make a mechanistic argument in a vacuum. You need to kind of, especially at this stage in the science, we need to see the whole pizza to really understand what's going on and what might be generalizable. And again, just to restate it, the way a mechanism operates depends on that crust and toppings. It depends on your local context and the particular outcomes that you are trying to predict or explain by going through this mechanistic theorizing process. So I gave you a metaphor just to remind you that it's, again, this process or series of events with multiple interrelated parts. Here's a metaphor for you to think about the actual process of trying to theorize using this mechanistic lens. So Alison, I think I was channeling you in your anthropology fieldwork days. But imagine, so to, again, a metaphor for understanding what this mechanistic theorizing kind of looks and feels like in my perspective. So pretend you're a photographer out in the wilds of implementation science or practice. You have your camera. I would argue that a mechanistic pathway is a snapshot of how you think a strategy works in relation to, again, the context and the outcomes you've anchored your causal argument within. So what are the implications of this metaphor that I think are important for talking about mechanisms and kind of understanding where we are in the field right now? So the first point is, with any picture of any living thing, a mechanism is not fixed, permanent, or absolute. So not every tree of this species will look exactly like this one. And again, when we think about the dynamic and often long-term nature of an implementation process, things change and the intervention itself can change. So this particular tree may evolve, like it's going to change its leaves in the fall, a branch might fall off. The point is, none of this is set in stone for any particular environment or time point. I also think that study-specific decisions, so how you structure your determinants and outcomes in terms of what you choose, how complex you go, what levels of analysis you include, your time horizon. Are you just trying to explain early implementation? Or are you trying to explain all the way to sustainment? all of these things matter and will affect the position and scope of your camera lens. So you can see how just Allison and Rosemary and I, we might be looking at the same strategy and the same tree and use the same camera and come up with slightly different things depending on what we're trying to explain or choosing to focus on. And along those lines, the same strategy could be explained with different mechanisms depending on how you set up your argument and what your project prioritizes. So again, we could all take pictures and they could all be equally valuable in terms of their predictive and explanatory value. And they can look different, and that's fine. And I view methodological options as basically different cameras. So I know one of the conversations that often comes with mechanisms is this kind of debate about which method to use. And I just think they're all different lenses and give you different types of information about the mechanistic process. So one thing that Rosemary and I have done in our thinking in this space is try to just acknowledge the difference between doing a mechanistic exercise for the purposes of research versus for the purposes of practice. So I used the kind of sciencey version where, again, we have the fancy camera, we're going for precise and technical. This might be a slower process. We're likely drawing upon existing theory and scientific evidence valued by those of us on the research side. We might be using jargony words and constructs. And on the practice side, maybe it's a little blurry and quick. Maybe the goal here is to use language that everyone understands, really go deep with the local context. We might be adding some theory and evidence, but a lot of this might be driven by practice, experience, and knowledge. So again, if we're doing it more for a research purpose, our goal is to advance theory in a scientifically rigorous way through careful and intentional measurement of these detailed elements. So we're using the best camera, we're making all these technical adjustments, we're going for high resolution and specificity. On the practice side, maybe the goal is just to get a good gut check with your team to ensure that you all are on the same page about why you're using a strategy and what you think is going to happen. And maybe that picture looks more like a quick little napkin drawing while you're at a coffee shop and not this like perfectly high resolution picture with the best camera. And so I wanted to end with just, I think right now, and we'll get into this, I'm sure soon, Rosemary and I see a lot of value around at least just the practical use of going through this process with your team and your partners. And I think where we are with the science right now is we have kind of 3 value propositions that we're really putting to the test. And that's why it's such an exciting time. And I would love to hear what you all think about this and where you stand. And I know this conversation started from a place of Allison not being fully bought into the idea of mechanisms, which is valid because we're still figuring it out and seeing what the value actually is. But I think what we're trying to figure out on the science side is, can we actually find these generalizable mechanisms or combinations of like a particular process that includes outcomes, mechanisms, context in a way that could actually hold across certain settings, outcomes, intervention types, and strategy types. I think we're trying to really prove to ourselves, because investing in a mechanistic inquiry on the science side uses a lot of your data collection and measurement capital. So I think we're putting to the test this idea: can mechanistic inquiries help us with transparency and reproducibility and replication on the science side? And last, I think we're trying to figure out, by studying mechanisms empirically, can mechanistic inquiries help us diagnose and respond better to implementation strategy failure or just unexpected findings? So that's all I have for this. I will stop sharing. I can figure out how to do that really quick. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. I every time now I've we've gone through that explanation a few times, and every time I learn more, I think about more things. So it's really great. And you're getting a lot of appreciation for that in the chat. And your metaphors in particular, I think are so helpful. I love the plant lady metaphor to begin with too. That one I don't think I had heard before. So lots of folks really appreciating that. So you managed to accomplish a lot, Rebecca, in 10 or 15 minutes. So thank you very, very much for that. Um, you've got some plant ladies in the audience as well. So this is now an open dialogue. I want to just get us started as everyone kind of processes through what you've shared, Rebecca, and the appreciation for this continuum between research and practice. I wonder if we could start, Rosemary, if you could kick us off with sharing an example of how you've worked on mechanisms, what insights that work has provided in your implementation research. Kind of give us, a story, I suppose, of how mechanisms have been useful for you and what you've learned from this area of inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so to start, I'll say most of what I'll be talking about is more in the realm of theorizing about mechanisms. So I kind of think about two different buckets within the field that we're talking about. One is many of us are theorizing about how do we think our implementation strategies work, to try to inform the selection of the strategies, to try to inform how we're operationalizing our strategies. And then I think there's another bucket of work that I think we'll talk about here today, which is mechanistic testing. So can we empirically establish a set of generalizable mechanisms, as Rebecca was talking about? I actually think that's challenging, and that's a little bit more where some of my skepticism or concerns lie. So hopefully we'll get into that as well. But I want to start with an example of mechanistic theorizing. And I want to be really
Rosemary, can I interrupt you for one
sure.
second? Do you have the ability to turn up your volume? Because some people can't hear you.
Let me try that. Thanks for letting me know.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a great interruption.
Some folks can hear you and some are
Pretty
having
good. Is
troubles.
that better?
Oh my gosh, so much better.
Yeah,
Yes.
just turn my input
Thank you.
volume up. Thanks for calling that out.
That's great. Thank
Um,
you.
so in case anyone didn't hear, I won't restate all of that, but I was just distinguishing between our mechanistic theorizing and our mechanistic testing. I want to talk about mechanistic theorizing, and that's really just how do I think this strategy works? So one
Yeah. Oh, we lost her. The background waves. Rebecca, sorry, Rosemary was having a challenge earlier with power, so we may get her back in a minute.
Okay.
Hopefully we will.
Would you like me to jump in with this?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So a lot of our Rosemary and my initial thinking on this topic came from our experience with an R1 with other colleagues who I think are on the call here. But basically we tried to theorize about 30 commonly used implementation strategies and identify mechanisms and mechanistic processes for these 30 strategies. And I think the process, so these are supposed experts in the room. You get us in the same room and you have five different, or how many different of us CPDs. And so I think the
Can you
specific
just
things that,
say what CPDs are for
oh,
anyone
I'm
who doesn't know
sorry.
what that
Yes,
is? That's
causal
okay.
pathway diagrams, which is one way of doing this. So I won't use that word, but let's say the five of us on this panel, we're all making CPDs. Or we're trying to identify mechanisms. What do you get by doing that process? First of all, you can really see some underspecified assumptions about the strategy itself. So it can clarify your actual operationalization of the strategy. And if everyone on the team is even operationalizing the strategy in the same way. And this can be especially important when you're getting into multi-level, multifaceted strategies like a learning collaborative. You can really operationalize that, and the core components and activities can look really different. So mechanisms theorizing can help you with that. I think it can also help unearth some blind spots. So when you do it with a team, especially this is where our practice partners are so valuable. Like there might be barriers that either we weren't considering or we weren't elevating high enough in terms of picking a particular strategy, so it can unearth blind spots about the context, including the types of barriers that you may need to focus on. It can also unearth kind of different assumptions about how a strategy works. So again, we were supposed experts, we were drawing on the literature, and we often had different ideas initially about what the strategy was actually doing. And I think that's so fruitful just in terms of, again, integrating practice and scientific perspectives, but also making sure that you have a really good reason for choosing a particular strategy and idea of what's going to happen. I know with my colleagues in Sweden too, it was really helpful when you got unexpected findings. So when we first compared basically a multifaceted strategy to a discrete strategy, I think the assumption often is the multifaceted is going to perform better. It didn't, and really digging into mechanisms helps you kind of understand why, or did we give this enough time? Did we target the right things? And so I think it's just, I can kind of pick apart every aspect of a causal process and show you the value of kind of interrogating it and just like getting it out in the open with your team to see if you're even on the same page about what's happening. I don't know if that's like a specific enough story. And Rosemary has more than I do. So I'm sorry you didn't get her on that one.
Oh, she's back.
Oh, is she? Okay, good. Sorry,
Yay.
Rosemary. You'll
I
do better than
hope this lasts. I'm in Seattle and it's our first snow of the year. And so transformers are blowing all around me. So hopefully I can stay on. Do you mind if I jump back into that example?
Please do. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Okay. So this is a project that I worked on in partnership with Mike Pullman, who's now at Pecori, and this was a project funded by the Impact P50 Center. But we were working with a digital mental health company called Health. And they have been trying to address the problem of most youth don't get access. Most youth who need mental health services don't get access to services. So they've been working on trying to marry both some digital mental health tools with cognitive behavioral therapy. So what they offer is they have these videos on how to use various cognitive behavioral therapy skills, and they also connect youth with near peers in kind of these like TikTok. Some of it is like TikTok style videos with some of the CBT content, but also some direct interactions with those near peers to kind of help them in using those cognitive behavioral therapy skills in their own work. And when they did an evaluation, what they realized is there was a lot of youth engagement with their near peers. There wasn't the same level of engagement with the CBT TikTok style videos. So they really weren't getting like a key part of the intervention to this group. So they had done an evaluation, did focus groups with some of the youth to try to understand why aren't they currently accessing those services or accessing those videos. And so like many of us do, identified these barriers and facilitators. They went through a process of prioritizing those barriers. And we were working with them and they wanted to figure out what strategies should we select. Now, I like this example because we weren't using like the Eric taxonomy necessarily. We were really staying in just layman's terms of you're trying to get this intervention to youth and how do we address that? And so we went through a process of what I would call more causal theorizing. So I'm going to take a quick aside and, today we're talking about mechanisms, but about, you know, the one explanatory variable that is the mechanism. We're often
You might, Rosemary, you might have lost power again, but if you didn't, it might help if you just turn off your video.
Here we go. I think my internet just rerouted. So
Let's
sorry,
and
folks.
It's okay. Sorry you're experiencing snow in the middle of this in Seattle. That hopefully will work.
How is this? How is this currently?
Seems okay so far.
Okay, I'm gonna stay off camera for a little bit.
Okay.
Please chime. Where did you last hear from me?
So you said we weren't using jargon, that we were just trying to figure out the a causal pathway, I think is where we left off.
Yes. So we were interested both in the question of like how would these strategies work, but we were also interested in trying to understand what's going to make them work best and under what circumstances do they work best. And so what we did was first we started with the set of barriers that they had identified. So these are things like, the youth can't access videos on their own timeline. So there were issues with the way that they were distributing these videos that impacted the time at which they wanted to access those. So it wasn't always convenient. So we organize these sets of barriers. And what I often experience is when I'm working with teams to start to brainstorm strategies, trying to then structure that process of which ideas are better than other ideas. How do we kind of like help the group kind of come towards better ideas? And this is where mechanisms came in for us, where this group was brainstorming various strategies. And to clarify, this group was not a set of researchers. So this included the clinical psychologists who were on the team who had been involved in this intervention development. It also included the CEO of this digital mental health app, and it included a software engineer and a project manager. So these are folks who are not familiar with the term mechanism necessarily. The psychologists were, but the others on the team were not. So we were asking simple questions like for each of these ideas that they threw out, how or why would that work? And that allowed the team to really naturally start to gravitate towards certain strategies and move away from other strategies. Going through that process also helped us to develop more of a simplified and parsimonious approach. So, what we realized in that process of articulating how various strategies would work is that even though we had 7 different barriers we were trying to address, we ended up landing on 2 different strategies that we felt like could address all 7 of those barriers through 6 different mechanisms. And while that sounds quite complicated, we were able to move through this very gradual process of asking ourselves very simple questions of how would this work? Under what circumstances would this work? And at the end of this process, I would say one other insight that this created for us of really going through this causal process was sometimes we have when we identify barriers and facilitators, the exact role of those barriers and facilitators isn't always clear. So I'm sure many of us on this call have ended up with like a checklist of barriers and facilitators and then trying to figure out like which of those should we be directly targeting with a strategy and which of those are maybe helpful context. And what do we mean by helpful context? And so one of the things that we asked ourselves in this process is, sometimes we can think about these as like moderators and preconditions. Exactly what those mean isn't super important. I like to think about this as like a light switch or a dimmer. So there's some things that can turn the effects of an implementation strategy on or off. So if that switch is on, that strategy can work. If that switch is off, that strategy has no chance of working. So oftentimes these are more of these discrete things. Are the resources there or are they not? Do we have the authority to make the decision or do we not? There's other factors that often come in the form of barriers and facilitators that can act more like a dimmer on a light switch, where the more of that thing you have, the stronger your strategy might work. Whereas the less of that thing you have, the weaker that strategy might work. And so for instance, what by prompting people and asking some of these questions, what we landed on was being able to organize some of our barriers and facilitators as things we weren't directly targeting, but things we needed to achieve in order for our strategy to work. So, for instance, one of the things they knew is that teens need to open and attend to the text messages that they were getting in order to be able to get them these video links. These teens also needed to have a phone, and there was variability in people's access to phones and times of day that they were able to access phones. And so that helped us to kind of organize what is the role that some of these barriers and facilitators are playing. At the end, this ended up informing this team's revamping of their strategy of how they were actually getting these TikTok videos out to folks. But I think what I liked about this example is that, you didn't need fancy expertise to do this. We helped structure this, but we used really simple questions to help people really think about the process through which these potential strategies might work to help them settle on something that they felt is likely going to be a stronger approach to improving engagement.
That was super helpful, Rosemary. Thank you so much. And there's some action in the chat that I'm gonna just bring forward because it's related to what you just shared, Rosemary. So one comment was that it sounds like the driver diagrams that we use in QI. And I was thinking something similar, which is that reminds me of process diagramming. And if you ask people to kind of lay out how something happens from when it's supposed to start to what your ultimate outcome is, it's a very QI-ish thing to do. So do you
Mhm.
have thoughts, either of you really have thoughts on potential parallels to some of the tools we use in QI, some of the thinking that we do in QI?
Yeah, I think that's a really great call out. Before getting specific to QI, what I'll say is there's a number of different ways to think about processes, to think about how does this work, under what circumstances does it work, and I don't think that there is one process or one model that rules them all. I think it depends on the question that you're trying to answer, the level of specificity that you need, and then like what your team likes to use and what's a good communication tool. So we might touch on like logic models at some point. I love logic models as a communication tool. For me, oftentimes I need a little bit more specificity to structure my thinking first and get into the nitty gritty, but then I like to communicate my thinking via logic models. Now, in terms of key driver diagrams, I think that fits into was it key driver diagrams or fishbone? Yeah, driver diagrams that was mentioned. In terms of key driver diagrams, it's the same for me as well. At least my experience with key driver diagrams, I think that they're really helpful in organizing what we might call like the barriers and facilitators or those drivers, and also are really helpful in then structuring conversation about what we might do to address that. Sometimes there's questions that I have, which are like, if we think about those light switch questions around what's going to make this work better or worse, or what might stand in the way of this working at all. And the reason why those questions matter is because, for instance, if that light switch question, that on and off light switch question, if there's a precondition or some factor you need to achieve that just can't be achieved in your setting, that should push you towards saying this isn't a good strategy for us to do. So I think that's one of the differences between something like a key driver diagram is I find that some of these other approaches are a little bit more specific in terms of some of the questions I might have at times, but sometimes I don't need to ask those questions and it's enough information. So I think that they can be complementary methods and are quite similar.
That's really helpful. And I'm gonna actually, I was gonna go one place, but now I'm gonna go another because of what you just mentioned about sort of identifying where there might be paths that are not fruitful to pursue through using these tools. Because someone says, I'm going to come back to a couple other comments, time permitting, but just because this is a good follow-up. Someone said, I want to hear about how to choose the best mechanism for implementation before harming people or resources. How do we evaluate whether a mechanism or strategy is correct or wrong at an early phase before measuring the outcome. And there's a similar question that just came in. Are they best considered up front as you're developing strategies or typically looked at after you've used the strategy for a while? These are really, really great questions. And just to throw it out there in the mix, since I think it all kind of is revolving around some key related issues. There was a question about like how long does this process take? So maybe we could think about that when we're thinking about mechanisms and identifying them, and potentially how much time that takes too, which is a lot. Just packed a lot into that.
That was like 20 questions in one.
Exactly.
I'm looking at these two recent chats though, and I'd actually like to acknowledge the front end of one of the ones that you're reading that says, "What is new about today's presentation for those of us who come from the medical world?" I think that's a very valid starting point. I think this whole idea of identifying mechanisms in the context of implementation strategies is absolutely drawing upon existing thinking that has guided other fields and other types of attempts to understand cause and effect. And so I think acknowledging that is a really good starting point. I think what I would say, my response to this would be, what is new is that the nature of what we're trying to explain how like a medical treatment works versus an implementation strategy, especially depending on the nature of the implementation strategy, which might involve multi-level change, a lot of different individual level behavior across different role types. And so I think the difference is we're currently putting to the test this existing kind of like lens and heuristic and way of understanding cause and effect. And we're seeing if we can bring it to our understanding of implementation strategies. In terms of choosing the best mechanism, I would flip that kind of the order there and say, I think identifying mechanisms helps us choose the best strategy. And there's not like a best mechanism. Similar to your analogy in medicine, it's not, a pill is not necessarily the best across all contexts. It depends on the body. It depends on the diagnosis. And understanding how that pill works can help you understand whether or not this is going to be the right fit for that particular person, or again, to bring it back to our language, maybe like the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And so in Charlotte's question here, in terms of when, I would argue it's better to do it up front, because what if it doesn't work? What if you are investing tons of money into using a particular strategy and something, again, like practice facilitation or learning collaboratives, like we are asking a lot of people when we say you should use this strategy. So if it doesn't work, if you don't have a sense of why or what to do differently next time, I think it leaves you in a really kind of like, what do we do now? And like, what do we do with these wasted resources? So I think mechanistic theorizing up front gives you kind of a blueprint to examine and kind of like work off of if you're not getting like strong effect sizes, or you're getting things that are not like what you expected in terms of how the strategy was supposed to work. But I want to pause there. I want to hear what Rosemary would say to that, or if she agrees with me too.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from Tess Faye is they want to like almost like do no harm or do less harm. And I actually see thinking about mechanisms up front as a good way to push us towards more effective strategies, even before we have the evidence to know whether or not that is going to be effective. So I think it strengthens our thinking and I think that we can intentionally do that by also thinking like shifting the questions that we're asking ourselves when we're talking about mechanisms. So not only asking yourself, like, if this works, how would it work? Or do I think this is going to work? But also asking, how could this go wrong? What are the mechanisms through which this implementation strategy could cause harm? Because our implementation strategies, can do harm, whether it's just the fatigue that they cause, or it's, even taking something like audit and feedback. Well, audit and feedback often does produce, it's one of our most studied strategies, and often does produce positive outcomes. We see that there's also negative outcomes from audit and feedback, depending on how you operationalize the strategy, whether people are seeing this as kind of surveillance versus something that is more motivating. And so I think when we think about mechanisms up front, even without the evidence, it can allow us to identify places where our implementation strategies may not be as effective as we want them to be, or may have some unintended consequences. Um, More broadly thinking about when should we focus on mechanisms? Is it upfront or after? I would say both. I mean, if you're starting upfront is always ideal to me, is to really think about how would this thing work under what circumstances. But also, yeah, I love this pre-mortem, yes. But also afterwards, many of us have done things where maybe we didn't really think through the how and the why, but afterwards we can kind of go back and try to understand, why do we think that worked? Or why didn't it work? There's actually a really great paper that was just published in, I think, Implementation Science Communications, about retrospectively going back and diagnosing why our strategies didn't work as well as we thought they would work. And there's learning that can come from that in terms of like, did we just choose the wrong strategy, or was there something along the way, maybe some of those light switch or dimmer factors that were influencing how well or whether this thing worked at all? So I don't think that it's a missed opportunity if you are kind of retrospectively going back and thinking about mechanisms as well.
I would just add too, like, in addition to that, it also highlights the time element. So I think sometimes, or it can help you think about, again, that sequence and that process and the time that it takes. So I think sometimes it looks like strategies aren't working. And if you are kind of articulating proximal outcomes and other signals that may precede a more late downstream outcome, like an implementation outcome, or even, change in client functioning or something, a lot of times we're not giving things time to work. And when you actually measure those early signals, you can say, like, oh, this is looking promising. And if we'd had, 2 more years, maybe we would have seen the change we were wanting. But versus like the strategy just didn't work and it wasn't effective. So it can kind of help disentangle some of just the timing element as well in terms of how a strategy unfolds.
I've got like 20 questions that I want to ask, but and I think we may need a part two of this. There's some really interesting stuff coming up in the chat and the Q&A. One thing that is being asked about is resources, and I'm going to share a resources slide with you all in just a few minutes. So we do have some key readings, most of which have been co-authored by our two amazing presenters today. So there's lots more. And I'm guessing, Rosemary, that folks would love a citation for that paper that you just mentioned.
Yes, I will share that.
Thank you so much. I want to just touch on a question that came up in the chat about, if you are involved in a study that recorded the implementation of a strategy, for example, conducting coaching sessions, can you talk about how you would develop a code book to code for mechanisms? And I just want to expand on this a little bit, which is what's coming up for me in relation to this question, which is, how do we collect data that will tell us about mechanisms? And we're working on some analyses right now to understand how the strategies worked, which are the mechanisms. And so I think, if you could speak to this question of how, if I'm framing this properly, Rohini, in terms of your question, like, how do you identify those mechanisms in your data?
Mhm.
Which to me goes back to, how do you collect data about the mechanisms?
Yeah, great questions. Um, I think that qualitative work is a great starting place for us to think about understanding mechanisms. It is, and there's a number of ways to do this. I think oftentimes mechanisms emerge in the narrative. So uh, I think sometimes our jargon is, we get too jargony and we often think about like, we don't all understand mechanisms. And I think we all implicitly really do think about like cause and effect and what happens in the middle. And I think there are clues in our language that can point to if then statements that we see. If when we did this, then this thing happened because of this. And so if anyone's interested, I a couple years ago wrote a paper called Theorizing is for Everybody. And we talk explicitly about this of like, how do we look for the clues around people's implicit theories about how things work? And some of that is inviting people to tell us the story in terms of how implementation effort unfolded over time, asking those questions of why, and then why do you think that happened, and then what happened next, and those things can start to describe that causal process of what's happened over time. So I think that there are clues in people's language around what the mechanisms might be. I think you can ask people about some of those processes that unfold over time. And then there's the whole quantitative realm of mechanisms as well, which I think, largely I don't think there's going to be one list of potential mechanisms. I think there's many different potential mechanisms. And I think as our measurement, our ability to measure some of those mechanisms gets stronger as we do more measure development, we can also test these things quantitatively. But I think a lot of the mechanisms work right now is very much still in this qualitative space.
Mhm. Um, there's there's so much here to get into. We probably have time for one more um topic to cover. Just in terms of your point, David, about how, to what extent are we in proposals really specifying our strategies or our mechanisms or both? Probably not very much, although this is just my opinion, and I know Rebecca and Rosemary are really familiar with the implementation research logic model as well. I think that what I've seen is that grant mechanisms that require the implementation research logic model to be included, that means that the mechanisms box is there in that diagram. So it is potentially something that we will see more of in terms of expectations for our proposals, of not only specifying our strategies, but the means by which we think our strategies may work, will work, are theorized or hypothesized to work. So it may not be something that we've seen a lot of historically, but my guess is we're going to be seeing more of it, because I think we're seeing more and more requests for proposals that are looking to include the implementation research logic model or something like that. Any thoughts on that, Rebecca and Rosemary?
Well, thank you for teeing us up, because Rosemary and I are both involved in a project that is looking for ways to improve the usability of the implementation research logic model. And if any of you are using it, you may have noticed in the original paper, all of the main sections except for mechanisms had a worksheet. And so one of the things that Rosemary and I have been working on, and that you can see in our responses today, are our efforts. We're creating materials to make the mechanisms box in the IRLM easier. So we are providing prompts for talking about this with your partners. Again, in kind of the informal, organic way that Rosemary is describing. We're providing tips on how to word mechanisms. We're providing like, where do you start? So this kind of blend of theory, literature, practice, experience. So I think you're right. Like with that type of with the IRLM becoming more required, I think maybe that could be a reason for people to think about mechanisms more, and that's something that we're trying to help people do more easily, because we were also part of interviews where people were talking about using the IRLM, and the mechanisms section was one of the most like avoided and kind of like scary one to try to use. So I totally agree. And that's something we've both been thinking about a lot.
I think it's safe to say that folks in this group here will be anxiously awaiting
You all
anything
know
and everything you
get
produce on these
get these papers
topics.
out. Yes. Thank
No pressure, but
you. No,
yeah,
we
that's
appreciate
hopefully this
it.
will be highly motivating for us to see much more of your thinking in this space. Sadly, I have to close us down because we just don't have much time left, and I want to make sure to show our last couple remaining slides. There's so much to talk about, just the tip of the iceberg, but you both have done an amazing job of really increasing the accessibility, I think, of these issues and just bringing so many ideas to the forefront, so many questions. There's much in the chat that we were not able to get to and in the Q&A as well. So many, many thanks to both of you. I'm just going to share our slides again really briefly to show you that there is indeed let me try to do this quickly uh, if I can. Sorry. Okay, I'm just going to skip past all of this. Couldn't get it advanced while we were chatting, so sorry for speeding through. Okay, so references, resources. There is a lot here. Some of our most foundational papers that Rebecca and Rosemary have mentioned. Really, really great stuff to look at here as well as more. And then we would really appreciate you evaluating our beachside chat today. This helps to keep us going, and we really do want and need your feedback. So I'll leave that up for just a minute, and I think it's in the chat as well. And then I want to mention that this Beachside Chat, as well as all of the other chats that we've done, are available on our YouTube playlist, as well as all of our methods workshops. So if you like this format, if you want to hear about other topics, please check out our playlist. If you want some methods workshops, those are available there as well. And there are more coming up, as you'll see here. We have another Beachside Chat in 2 weeks that is going to be another fantastic session about community engaged HIV implementation research. This will be a bit longer of a Beachside Chat with a panel of amazing folks who are community-based members of community advisory boards who are going to be talking about their very cool work with disseminating implementation research. So I highly recommend that. It's going to be a different format. It's amazing. We've practiced, and it's just going to be very exciting with videos and all kinds of things. There's another rapid workshop coming up in mid-April, and we've got a couple more beachside chats coming up and workshops. So we hope you will continue to join us. If you want to join our listserv to hear about all of our upcoming events, here is a QR code for that. And with that, I'm going to close us out. I wish we had another hour or two or three or all day to keep talking because there's so much more to talk about. But it's great that we're leaving at a point of curiosity and excitement and interest and more work to do, more thinking to do. So can't thank you enough, Rebecca and Rosemary, for engaging in this. Super interesting. You're getting lots of love. Hopefully, you can see that from the audience. I really appreciate your time and expertise, and really appreciate the audience being here and being so engaged, and appreciate my team behind the scenes making all of this run very, very smoothly, even in the context of snow in Seattle. So, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a great weekend. And we hope to see you at future UCLA 3R Hub events. Thanks, everyone. Take good care. Bye.